So let's talk about some of the statements the defendant makes to law enforcement after the murder. She is asked by Detectives Parshall and Verna whether her husband had life insurance, and she says she doesn't know. She only thinks he had one policy, and that was a policy for Luigi, Fabio's son, in Toronto, in Canada. They ask her to go through the events of what she did and who she met with on the day of the murder, because, again, this crime scene looks very targeted, very suspicious, and they're wondering if something or someone that she came in contact with somehow followed or came to her home. And so she makes no mention of meeting with Robert Baker at all. She also, as I said earlier, makes no mention of any racquetball injury. She also says she has no knowledge of the surveillance camera system, and all of this is recorded, and if you don't remember it, you can read through the transcripts, but listening to her voice and her demeanor as she tries to distance herself and make light of and downplay and minimize is also very important. Again, another key reason why it's important to record your conversations with witnesses and potential defendants. So there is a record going forward, not just of what was said. So someone can't get up like Ms. Obad on the stand and say, well, I didn't say that. Well, there's a transcript, there's a tape. So that someone can't say that they didn't say or that they did say something that the recording shows different. So you have that in this case. She also mentions very specifically that she had no remote access on her phone to view the surveillance cameras at her house. She tells the detectives, as I mentioned earlier, that the safe is hidden behind a mirror in her walk-in closet, which is also hidden behind a door. She tells them, as I mentioned earlier, that Fabio kept his gun, some gold coins, and some gold in the safe. So again, not items you would expect Fabio to be removing from the safe during that day as he's working from home. He's not playing with his gun. He's not looking at his gold coins. He's not looking at gold. Those are Exhibits 23 and 24. Also, all three co-conspirators very shortly begin using the same encrypted app, WhatsApp. And you heard that both Baker and Anna tried to claim that the defendant was using WhatsApp at some time prior to the murder. However, again, you heard from two different experts in this case, Investigator Jake Gibson, who used to be a DA investigator, as well as Officer Curtis Davis, who looked at the extractions from the defendant's cell phone, and they found that the defendant didn't register to use WhatsApp until after the murder. After she deleted Viber, a couple days later, she switches to using WhatsApp. And it's pretty significant that, again, all three co-conspirators are acting together, doing the same thing during the same time period. Not coincidental that all three of them are registering and beginning to use WhatsApp. And again, as I also mentioned, while they could argue that they used Viber, an encrypted app, prior to the murder because they're hovering up an affair, now there's no husband. What's the reason why you're trying to cover up your communications? Who's going to be looking at your phone, right? So what is it they're trying to hide? And then, as you recall, after the murder, the defendant starts doing these public posts on her Instagram account in order to engender sympathy. And she sets up the shrine on Fabio's favorite chair on the patio, same location where he was murdered 2 days prior. And of course, this sort of takes on a much more sinister appearance when you look at it now in hindsight after coming through a couple of months of this trial and learning all of the machinations and the things the defendant did, in this case to have her husband murdered, and now she's posting pictures of the place where he's killed online. So it takes on, again, a very different perspective. And also, if you recall that, again, Monica Sementilli, Fabio's older sister, who taught him everything he knew about the business and worked together with him for years in various salons before he moved his family to California, when she comes into town with their mother and sister and the kids and their spouses on the 25th, they ask the defendant about what happened on the day of the murder. And the story the defendant gives them is radically different from the one she tells law enforcement, which isn't surprising because we heard that she does this all the time. She lies and she changes up the story. As Deborah Obad called it, shady behavior. And she claimed that she took Fabio to a colonoscopy appointment that morning, which we know was false because we saw what happened on the surveillance video and the cell records of where she went and what she did. That she and Fabio ran some errands. I think instead of saying a power washer at this point, she said it was a weed whacker because it was a lie. And she said they went out, they had a great lunch, they spent a beautiful day together, she said, and then she dropped Fabio off, remember, at home because she was going out to Ralph's to pick up the ingredients she needed for the dinner, the fatina she was planning on cooking that night. And this is when, of course, she also tells them that the safe had been broken open by the robbers and the lock was broken. And I talked to you earlier about the alert that came at 2:03 and the mobility records and what happened during that week when the family saw the surveillance video and the defendant came home and became very angry that they had watched that without her. And then you heard that in the weeks following the murder and the months, the defendant was constantly complaining about the fact that she and her daughters didn't have enough money. And there's a text string between the defendant and Morella. It's Exhibit 610, where the defendant even talks about the estate attorney and hiring an estate attorney to try and acquire money from Fabio's estate. And Morella becomes so concerned for her sister-in-law because they had been like sisters all these years, and her nieces, that she asks her partner Marco to help her. And so then you heard the defense try to portray the defendant as the victim, when in fact what the evidence showed is that she lied, cheated, manipulated, and fooled so many people who cared about her, who loved her, but suddenly all of the people who tried to help her are the ones at fault here, who shouldn't be believed. And so you also heard what happened, that in their tradition, they have what's called a 30-day anniversary 30 days after the death. And there are church services and memorials and things of that nature. And after the fact, Morella and Marco had a lot of the people that came to the services back to their house up in Canada, and the defendant came. Sam Pulera was there, and they were in the garage that night smoking because it was raining outside. And so the defendant then proceeded to tell all of them that she wanted to be left alone. She was tired of everybody calling. She was tired of them coming down and staying with her. She wanted to be left alone to do what she wanted to do because she wanted to be free, and that Fabio would want her to move on. And remember, this is 30 days after his death. So we're talking about an almost 20-year marriage, and then the words that if she wanted somebody, she's going to find somebody. Now, when we talk about the local funeral service in the Valley on January 29th, that following Sunday, and then the wake at the Sementilli home, we know that Robert Baker, who was the only one that wasn't connected to Fabio at this location, was there at the invitation, obviously, of the defendant. Because remember, this is a memorial for the people that want to get together and grieve and celebrate his life and share stories about him and memories. So ask yourselves, if she wasn't involved in a murder conspiracy, who invites their lover to their husband's wake?
So a rule is, for instance, counsel can make an argument.
And this is the one piece of evidence on top of all of the others that I've talked to you about over the last couple days that shows how arrogant these two individuals are, because obviously they didn't think they were going to get caught. And he stood out because he was the one person there, as you heard, that didn't belong. And so the people from Wella, family members, were wondering, who is this character who sticks out? And we also know that earlier that day, while the family and friends are at the funeral service in the Valley on January 29th, that Sunday, Baker, recall, on that same day drives up to Victorville, because you have those records from the burner phones that he purchased, recall? And I think they were under the name Daniel something or other. We're going to see it in a sec. And he purchases some burner phones, and remember, he has to get her the burner phone before she leaves, because she's leaving for Canada 2 days later on January 31st, because Wella is repatriating Fabio's body. They're sending his body back to his home country for what they thought at that time was going to be a burial. And so he needs to get her the burner phone so that they can continue communicating. And so he obviously did so that night. Another thing that I wanted to point out, I also mentioned a few moments ago that the posting of Fabio's favorite chair in the shrine that the defendant set up with the cigar that, if you recall, Dave Diaz said he had just brought over to Fabio a couple days before, and some of Fabio's favorite things, and took on a sinister quality when you look at it in hindsight. But also notice where the defendant and Robert Baker are sitting around this fire pit, the same area where Fabio was found slaughtered the week prior by Baker with the assistance of the defendant. And there were numerous people who said they felt very uncomfortable when they went over to the Sementilli home to pay condolence calls during that week, because the defendant was going out to that location and showing people this is where he was killed, and everybody felt very uncomfortable because what they knew had happened there. So here are those T-Mobile records. Daniel Jones, you can see from T-Mobile with the same address. That's a fake address for these burner phones. And then, of course, when the defendant goes to Canada, we know she takes the ZTE burner phone with her because, of course, it says on January 31st, welcome to Canada. And so then, again, this is February 8th, and February 8th of 1997 was the 20th anniversary of Fabio and the defendant, and she makes this post, and she tells her sister Anna that she wants to go home. She wants to go back to California because she wants to be alone with the girls so the three of them can grieve together. And instead, what we learned was on that night, as soon as she gets back home, she leaves the girls and she goes out with Baker that night until the early morning hours of the next day. And as I talked about earlier, where I told you that the defendant has a history of using people to do her dirty work, we know that Anna comes into town after the funeral services in Toronto to stay with the defendant, but she leaves town on February 19th. And that same night, the defendant is using her daughter, Jessica, in case anybody calls or texts. Don't say you even have a friend over. Don't answer. Just say you're home, or Selena or something. It's nobody's business. And again, defendant's out with Baker that night and doesn't get home until 2:20 in the morning. Now, Anna also told you that she was aware that during this time period, State Farm paid money to replace that DVR system, and as she said, to do stuff around the house, which Anna told you she thought was excessive. And so the defendant took that money and she repainted, she got new carpet, she bought new drapes. But again, you'd think that a mother who cared an ounce about having security and making sure her kids are safe at the location where her husband's been murdered, when she's going to be leaving them alone, the first priority would be to replace the security system or buy some kind of a more significant security system, but she never does that. And again, on February 19th, she's asking her daughter to lie for her, and we know that she's out with Baker until the early morning hours of the following day on the 20th. Now, on that same day, on February 20th, she has a recorded call with Detective Parshall, which we played for you, where again, he asks what she did on the 23rd to go back over the details. And again, she mentions going to the gym, but she never mentions Baker. She doesn't mention any type of an accident. And she again mentions going shopping, but fails again to mention that she met up with Baker at the Target. This is Exhibits 39 and 40, the recording and the transcript. And then we heard that on February 21st, Detectives Parshall and Verna come to the Queen Victoria home in order to sit down and have a more lengthy interview with the defendant since the night of the murder. And you heard the recording of that particular interview. And this is the same day, February 21st, where at the beginning you heard the defendant mention that she had family in at that time that was staying with her. We know that's the same day that Jessica is interviewed. Ernie Valorano, Fabio's friend, is there that day. He's interviewed. And again, the defendant lies to them. She tells them she didn't have remote access to the home surveillance cameras. In fact, she goes further, doubles down now, says she doesn't have any contact information for the installation company. Remember that whole email chain with Sean Conn? She tells law enforcement that the reason she might not have any of that information is because Fabio carried a lot of cash in his pockets and he probably paid them in cash, so there might not be any paper trail. So there's no way for her to find the name of the company. She never mentioned that she was in communication with Baker that entire day. She never mentioned again seeing Baker twice that day. And then she comes up with this news story that she tries to float, that maybe when they ask her, has anybody had any accidents? Is there any reason why there should be blood in your house? Because remember, this is February 21st, and what you learned was that on the 14th of February, detectives received the preliminary results from the crime scene in the Porsche with blood samples that match up to Baker. And so they ask, is there any reason why anybody else's blood should be in this house? And she says, they don't tell her about the DNA results, but she says, well, Fabio might have cut himself trying to fix a power washer. And once again, doesn't mention any racquetball injury, which obviously would have been relevant to this particular area of conversation. She mentions that gold coins are missing, which we know had been kept in the safe. And she downplays her relationship with Baker to the extent that she even pretends not to know his last name. Remember, she says, Robert, he's the racquetball coach. I think his name might be Baker. And she also tells the detectives that Baker had never been home, to the home prior to the murder. Now, on that same day, as I said, February 21st, when they interview people separately. law enforcement does. And Jessica brings up, when they ask, is there anything odd that's ever happened? Has anybody, ever been to the home or stayed at the home? And she brings up the time when she found Baker sleeping in her mother's bed while her father is out of town. And so they go back to the defendant and they say, well, who's this? They don't rat out Jessica, but they say, well, who's this guy Baker? And that's when she says, oh, he's just the racquetball coach. And Jessica tells the detectives that the night that Baker slept over, her mother came home at 2:30 in the morning, and she also tells them she never told her father about it because her mother told her not to say anything to him. So again, another example of the defendant teaching, coaching her daughters to lie for her, grooming them, and at this point in time, going backwards, she basically is using the daughters to keep information from their father. And this is also when, if you recall, Ernie Valorano's testimony, when he came in to testify at trial and talked about this, that he said that when the detective spoke to him that day and they asked him if he had any information, if either Fabio or the defendant maybe ever had an affair, he was offended by it. And he was appalled that law enforcement would even be asking him these questions about his close friends. And then he relates to them the story about how the year prior, he and Fabio traveled to Thailand for a golf trip, and that they would have dinner every night after they golfed, and then Fabio would rush back to his room because he wanted to FaceTime, and accounting for the time difference, he wanted to be able to reach his wife and his girls, like you saw in the OPI post, his beloved girls, so that he could speak to them every single night. And so Ernie testified that he never even suspected or thought for a moment that either Fabio or the defendant would have ever had an affair. And so, again, as I said, a lot of these people, once they learn several months after that the defendant's arrested with her lover for Fabio's murder, you can imagine that one would be quite angry and feel extremely betrayed, especially given all of the things these very good, decent people did for her and her daughters. So later that same night, after she has this interview with law enforcement, the defendant on February 21st is out again with Baker until about 1 a.m. You heard about all of this and the photographs, and contrary to the defense spin story that Baker was the one that was in charge, it's fairly clear that the defendant's actions show she's the one. She's the one who calls the shots. And one of those examples was when they're out and the defendant comes out from a bar that they're in, and she initiates an encounter with a bouncer out front of the location where surveillance officers are watching this go down. Baker is inside the bar, but if you recall, they observe her. She sits down next to a bouncer on a bench, the bench out front. She starts touching the bouncer on his inner thigh area. She puts her hand behind his neck and then kisses him on the lips, and then goes back in to the bar and later comes out later with Baker. Appears they have some sort of an argument. He walks away from her in the parking lot, and the defendant becomes very upset and starts crying, and certainly appears to shed more tears and be more upset over the argument she has with Baker that night than she ever did when it came to her husband's murder. So the following night, on February 22nd, we learn that the Gangs and Narcotics Division, who's tasked with doing the surveillance at this point in time in February, follows the defendant and Baker, and the detectives, Verna and Parshall, are trying to figure out where Baker's staying because they know he's not going back to his house, and so they follow him back to Roger Brown's apartment in Glendale that night. And so you heard from Roger Brown, who's been friends with the defendant since 1997. Over the years, since Baker's been arrested, he's made numerous jail visits to meet with him. Baker calls him regularly from jail, and he testified actually twice that he used to play basketball, I think, with Baker and some other individuals, including this attorney, Howard Lynch. And if you recall, Howard Lynch, his name came up once again once the defendant and Baker were arrested, because they're using his law office to call through to make clean calls initially so they can leave messages with him and his staff. And then once Howard Lynch decides this is probably not a real good idea and he could get into trouble, he has a conversation with Baker, and they switch to using April, if you recall, to call through. And so we also heard Roger Brown say that the defendant, who he was introduced to by Baker as Madonna, came to his apartment numerous times while Baker was staying there after the murder, because obviously Baker's on the lam. He's gone from Lashane Holmes to Al Birdsong's in Vegas to Sheila and Ricardo's, and now he's staying with Roger Brown in mid-February. And Roger Brown at some point takes Baker over to the Starbucks to meet up with the defendant, again, who he knows as Madonna, and he testifies that he had actually met Madonna and Baker the year before when Baker brought her to Roger Brown's birthday party. And so he testifies to some of that, but again, he tries to indicate he doesn't think Madonna ever slept over, but he was in another room and he didn't pay attention and things of that nature to try and distance himself. And we also know that the night before his arrest, on June 13th, that's the day, remember, when the defendant is returning from Toronto after the Mirror Awards, and she flies home in Baker's army shirt and takes photos. Baker comes over to Roger Brown's apartment and gives him a new phone number. And that number, if you recall, again, connecting up little pieces of information, turned out to be the burner phone number for one of the phones that Baker purchased in Victorville on the date of January 29th, before going to the wake where he gives the defendant the one he bought for her. And so on the 25th, again, the defendant is out with Baker, this time till 3:15 in the morning. We heard from the surveillance crew, G&D. They follow the defendant and Baker, and the defendant picks Baker up again from Roger Brown's. They go out. They arrive back at the apartment at 12:45 in the morning, where the defendant then stays until 3:14 the next day, which is now February 26th, before she goes home. We know that on February 26th, she flies to Toronto for Fabio's 1-month memorial of his death, just to give you the timeline of the pieces. And then March 4th, after the defendant returns to the Los Angeles area after the 1-month memorial in Toronto, where she returned on March 3rd, she immediately resumes the same pattern where she's going out with Baker. On this date, March 3rd, she and Baker stay at a hotel until 6:18 in the morning the next day, and we heard about that during the cross-examination of the defendant's sister, Anna. Now, you also heard that the defendant made a series of calls to Detective Barshal, and once again, Detective Barshal and Detective Verna recorded, if at all possible, every time she would call. And you heard a set of those recordings along with a transcript, and during this phone call on March 8th, the defendant is asking Detective Barshal about whether or not there's been any DNA results. And of course, Barshal isn't going to share his investigative information She again reiterates now for the third time, fourth time, she doesn't know the make or model of this DVR system. She can't locate any documents relating to the system. And she says, again, she puts it on Fabio, that he's the one that purchased and replaced the system with the installers, but she has not replaced the security system. And Parshall is repeatedly asking her this question every time he speaks to her, because the defendant claims she still is waiting for the insurance money. And we heard that wasn't true from the defendant's sister Anna, who said the amount of money that they sent her was excessive, and so the defendant was redoing the house.